So, hello everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Uni Chats, the podcast where we interview university lecturers and professors on their field of study. My name is Jack, and with my friend Kenji, here we have joined today our first guest, Professor Gideon Baker of the School of Government and International Relations, with his main expertise being politics and philosophy. He has written over 10 academic books with the topics ranging from civil society, democracy, philosophy, and nihilism. Gideon Baker, welcome to Uni Chats.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. Thank you
So,
so
just
much.
for a bit of context for our audience. So, just who is Gideon Baker, and how did he become the university professor that he is today?
Well, I mean, first of all, I should say I'm an associate professor, which is not quite a professor, but I guess it's pretty close. Well, I mean, what do you want to know? I wouldn't say that there was any career path. I came from a relatively poor community and religious community in Manchester in the north of England, where almost nobody had a degree. University was a place that actually my parents had gone to university, but they were pretty much the only people in the community who had. So university was a very alien thing in the community I grew up in, and of course it was a religious community, a Christian community. It was also, universities were very dangerous places, full of crazy ideas. I wish that were the case. It's subtly not as true as I would like it to be. So the university was a place that I aspired to study at, but I never had any idea of an academic career. That was something just happened because the opportunities presented themselves. I got a scholarship to do a PhD, managed to get some publications, which led to me getting my first position in University of Salford in Manchester, where I was for a few years. Then I moved to University of Lancaster, also in the north of England, and in 2007 I came out here.
What made you
12 years.
What made you move to Australia?
My wife is originally from Brisbane. Well, she's from Germany originally, but grew up in Brisbane. So, well, it's a long story, but it involved a job swap that became a sort of more permanent thing. And here I am 12 years later.
I remember in Intro to Politics lecture, you said something along the line of, I can't live in Gold Coast because people here are way too optimistic. I remember actually.
I hope I didn't say I can't live on the Gold Coast, because I do, and I have for a number of years, as I was just saying. But maybe growing up under the clouds and the rain and the moorlands of northern England makes the shiny, sunny optimism of the Gold Coast seem a little bit alien to me. But I mean, I in many ways I like that.
Right.
I like the optimism. But I'm not personally an optimistic person. So.
Well, to be fair, I do much prefer the cold winters than the hot summer days here on the coast. So,
me too. I'm getting the longer I'm here, the more I'm finding the summers are a bit of a struggle. Yeah, but
so if you can just get closer to the microphone,
sure.
Appreciate that.
Sorry, just maybe just a bit of a quieter voice, because the other mics are kind of conflicting just a little bit. So sorry about that. It's just unfortunately due to the acoustics in this room, it isn't too optimal, but that's okay. We'll have to work with what we've got. So if you don't mind, I'll just get into maybe just the first question here about your writing. So you've written, and please correct me if I'm wrong, 10 books over the years?
I don't think it's 10. I've edited and co-edited 2 or 3. And I've got 3 single-authored books. So I've got a number of books, but 10 might be a little bit
a bit much.
a bit much.
So your most recent book being released in 2018, what was the writing process like to write those books? Because a lot of them are pretty big and spanning. They must take a huge amount of efforts and to source all of that and to be able to write all that. So how was it like to write all of those books? It's
a good question. It's one of those processes that I think each book is probably different, but for me, it's got to begin with a problem. There has to be a question. I know all my books have been quite different. I think at the end of each book that I write, each research project, I sort of have the desire to tear it down to do something completely new. So that hasn't necessarily helped me career-wise, that I take on such different topics each time that I write a book. But it's the only way I know how to keep interested. I wouldn't be able to motivate myself to write. Some people manage to write books their whole career on one topic, which I admire, and of course leads to some excellent scholarship. But it's not for me. For me, there needs to be a new challenge, a new question.
Well, I guess you could say that's probably one of the great things about politics. Like, there's so much depth and so many different topics that you could do and you can write about. That's like it can warrant all of those different types of books that you can be able to write about and discuss.
I mean, the number of topics is almost infinite. But then again, there has to be, you have to have, as I was saying, a reason for going in any particular direction. And for me, it's always been questions that, in fact, it's clearer when I look back on the books than when I start them. But looking back, there's always a reason relating to my own experience and my own life. The book prior to the nihilism book on ethics of hospitality was clearly related to my experience of being a guest, and I'm now an Australian citizen, but moving to another country.
Right.
All of those questions of what it is to be a foreigner, what it is to leave your home country and to be welcomed as a stranger. Not that somebody coming from the UK is completely strange and alien in Australia, but it's still, I think it gave me a personal experience of being a guest, being a stranger, and that sparked my interest in the ethics of hospitality. But more recently with the nihilism book, I think it's very much related to my background, my question of how it is that the world can be a strange place, that you can find yourself not at home in the world, of feeling like you belong in some way to some other world, which for me is the experience of nihilism. So, and that's a common experience for people, I think, who've grown up in religious communities and families where there may be an emphasis on the other world, heaven, a world where things work properly, as opposed to this world that we find ourselves in, where it's sort of sinful and fallen. So it's a concrete experience, but it leads to this question of how is it possible to find the world not your home. So again, it seems like a very abstract topic, nihilism, but for me it has a concrete relation to my own life and experience.
Right. Okay. So did you I assume you've read some of the Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche?
Yeah.
Nietzsche's work. Yeah. I'm trying to read Beyond Good and Evil, but it's pain in the ass. I can't. I've got a routine. On Wednesday, I go to a cafe next door, and I'll try to read Beyond Good and Evil. But I would spend
with a hard copy or on
hard copy.
So you're trying to sort of virtue signal.
I'm trying it, and I would spend I would spend 2 hours in your trying to understand one passage, because it's just so dense.
Yeah.
And how did you manage to? So you've read all of the things like Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Well, I mean, I would say that my experience of reading philosophy is very similar to yours. That when my first book of philosophy was Kierkegaard's Danish philosopher, 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. His book Fear and Trembling, which is about his retelling of the story of Abraham being told to sacrifice his son by God, and then at the last minute having his hand held back and not going through with it. But it's a story about faith and sort of the leap of faith. And I didn't understand. I sort of knew at some level that something very interesting was going on, something that related to my own religious background, but I couldn't really make head or sense of any particular bit of it. But the impression it left on me was powerful. And I think philosophy, like any other field of study, has its own language.
Yeah.
Its reference points. Nietzsche's constantly, without ever having a footnote. You wouldn't expect a footnote from Nietzsche, but he's constantly referencing the ancient Greeks in particular. He was a philologist, so he was a professor at Basel in Switzerland, studying basically ancient Greek words. and so he's steeped in ancient Greek culture, and many of his references are there. Some of his references are contemporary to his own time and place, so they can be hard to pick up on as well. So yeah, it's like any field. Initially, you just don't have enough of those reference points to be able to orientate yourself.
Yeah.
But the more you read, the more you sort of know where you need to look next, and then you might go and read some of the Greeks.
Yeah,
and then once you read
definitely.
some of the Greeks, you think, oh yeah, I can see what Nietzsche's going on about there. And it's just sort of a process of going backwards and forwards. And like anything else, if you do enough of it, it starts to make a certain sense.
Yeah, I'm trying. And
Yeah, definitely. Because I know that when people read a lot of philosophy, first of all, they usually think it's very dry, and they usually think it's very boring.
Yeah.
But, like, how do you think we're able to communicate the point that this stuff is actually really interesting and it's really fascinating, but, like, it's that bar to entry that seems to be a little bit high? Like, how would we be able to maybe not advertise it better, but, like, you know, maybe try and make people more interested in it? Because it does have a lot of very, very interesting things about human nature and like who we are as people, but we can't really seem to get past the entry level of, oh, this is dry, this is boring, like I don't want to read any more of it.
Yeah, it's hard. And I think probably it's increasingly difficult for us the busier we get and the more connected we get to find the time and space to sort of dip into Plato or Nietzsche or, you know, so that there's no point pretending that at a certain point you don't have to just force yourself like you're doing, Kenji, to engage, to read this stuff. You can't just sort of, unfortunately, it doesn't work by osmosis. You know, I've always thought it'd be great if all the books I'd carried around in my bag, I'd sort of absorb the contents without reading them. You know, sometimes you think if you carry it around for long enough, maybe but sadly that doesn't happen. But a lot of philosophy is very abstract, and for me abstraction has always made a certain sense because, you know, you're taking everyday detail and leaving that a bit behind and coming up with general principles, but it has its drawbacks, which is that abstraction can be very dry, very dusty, and it's not for everybody. But I think that as you guys know, because I've gone on about it a lot in class, I think ancient philosophy, you know, Greek philosophy, was very much concerned with the question of how to live. It was a quest for the true life. So it was very, you know, much more applied than maybe people think. And I think that although there's been a lot of abstraction and a lot of forbidding books and texts, nonetheless, that question of how should I live is the sort of core question of philosophy. And people who read philosophy, they might hide behind sort of scholarly interests and erudition and all the rest of it. But, you know, why would you read philosophy if on a certain level life didn't make a whole lot of sense? And that's certainly true for me. Like sheer perplexity at why is this living business so complicated?
It is
drove
very
me
complicated.
to read philosophy.
Absolutely.
I think you've got to have questions. You're not going to read philosophy if everything's ticking along nicely. You've got no questions. You're making money. You're popular. Why would you read philosophy? To a certain extent, there has to be a question mark over how should I live.
And that's the whole thing too about, like, just in general, about asking questions about the world that we live in and all that. And that kind of nicely ties into the next question that I kind of got here. But it's like, in a world today where we often don't question much, how important do you think it is that we do ask questions, even if they can be a bit controversial? Or, you know, people might be going, well, why are you asking a question about that? Like, this is something that shouldn't be questioned. Like, you know, what would you probably say to people like that?
Well, I think, as you know, because again, you've heard me go on about it in class, I think questioning is fundamental, because otherwise we just have to settle for such cliched, hollow answers. I mean, when, for example, we're told by political elites or in the media that we live in a democracy, you know, what does that mean? What is democracy? And why would we be able to claim that we live in one? To me, it's not so much should we question as if questioning is optional, but more, how could you not question those claims? And once you begin to realize how questionable so many of the claims that are thrown around in our everyday discussions in the media, politicians and so on, once you realize how questionable so many of their claims are, you're sort of forced to question. And then there's a snowball effect. And therein lies a problem, because questioning does lead to a certain nihilism, where the more you question, as Socrates found out 2,500 years ago, if you ask people, what is courage, even if you ask courageous generals, they might be able to do courage, but they can't tell you what it is. And so questioning can lead to a certain sense of crisis, in which we suddenly perceive how little ground there is under our feet. And so questioning can be dangerous. It can lead to all sorts of problems. You were getting along perfectly well before you had questions, and then suddenly you realize that there's a lot of what we count for truth is a tissue of lies, and that's a crisis.
It did really shake me in the intro to politics, because I remember getting somewhat really upset to the statement you made about democracy is just a sham or something like that. And I've never questioned about it, and I think that's one of the reasons why I got into philosophy, because I remember I was on the bus way home, and I'm looking at all these bus seats, and I was so disorienting from the reality. Because I think that's what happens to the people when you ask them such a question, because that's a pillar of it's a value, right? Democracy. And if you poke it, of course people are going to show reaction to it.
Because we're invested in these things.
Yeah, definitely.
And once you start pulling at one part, the whole thing can come unraveled, and that's not a comfortable feeling.
Oh, it was scary.
So you will get that response when you encourage people to question. And I've been teaching this first year course for quite a number of years, and your response is, I'm really pleased when I get it. It shows that you're listening. But it's quite common, and I think that's what I was trying to articulate earlier, that my own experience was, I started reading philosophy when I started to recognize that I didn't have a whole lot of answers, and I was looking for answers, and philosophy didn't really give them to me, but it certainly enabled me to ask better questions.
Yeah, because the thing is about the whole point of asking questions, I never want to be at a point in my life where I want to stop asking myself questions, because for me personally, I find that pretty dangerous. In and of itself, if you stop questioning the things that you're being told, or the things that you see on the internet or on TV and stuff like that, I never want to leave myself not questioning anything. And that's how you get a bit of, blind faith in ideology, because I was on a kind of trajectory towards one certain bit of ideology, and I would kind of, subconsciously, I wouldn't even know that I was doing it, just ignore any other piece of criticism or, people asking, why do you truly believe in that? And, I just go, well, I just thought it was the right thing for me to believe, but it obviously wasn't. It was to me at the time, but at the same time, I wasn't really it was anybody else outside of my own worldview was kind of not wrong, but
I don't think we should beat ourselves up about this. I mean, Nietzsche talks about how we need lies, we'd perish from the truth, and it's we need these. Most of us, most of the time, need these comforting lies in order to get a grip, to get a toehold in the world. But once we see what it is we're doing, it becomes impossible to sustain it. It's only while you don't sort of catch sight of yourself in the mirror, asking questions of all the others, but never asking questions of yourself. And once you catch sight of yourself doing that, it's like the genie's out of the bottle. You can't sort of go back. So again, the questioning is a great resource for introducing change in your life, but it's also threatening for that same reason. But I would say, coming back to where you started out, questioning certainly makes us less governable. There's nobody who's easier to govern than somebody who has no questions. So just in that sense, I think questioning is a good thing.
And Nietzsche was saying something along the line of, without knowing the danger of this journey to know the truth and end up finding it's not really truth. I think he said that it was dangerous because again they suppose truth, and once you find out that it's all lies, like of course you get into nihilism.
Yeah.
And I was reading this book and thinking, what the hell is this? And it was very radical to me because what am I supposed to believe? So I think one of the things about Nietzsche is I think it's attractive to many young people because it really, I would call it radical. It's really shocking. It shakes you, right?
Figure,
yeah.
Even on the cover of the book, he's like, he's up like that, and like, like God rays and everything around him.
I don't think that's his cover design.
Might have been from the particular edition, but as Kenji was saying, it's definitely very radical for people, and that's like it's attractive to young people, definitely.
Attractive and threatening. Yeah. And I think Nietzsche is saying that. One of the things he's saying, sometimes quite often he contradicts himself, but I think this is a thinker who doesn't want to stand still, talks about, thinking being like dancing, where you got to stay light on your feet, and that, he doesn't want to become ponderous and leaden-footed. One of those sort of ridiculous figures who finds early in life his principles and then never budges. We all know people like that. And in fact, academia encourages us to be like that because you're going to get more career success and more publications if you stick to your guns. But for me, thinking is movement, because life doesn't stand still. To put it crudely, life doesn't stand still, and so if our thinking stands still, then it doesn't really bear any relation to living. And I think Nietzsche's acutely aware of that. So that's why on some level he does contradict himself. He doesn't stand still. But I think what he's saying about truth, amongst other things, is that if we are looking for timeless truths, then truth will disappoint. It can only lie because nothing stands still. Everything changes. But he's proposing a sort of different truth there. He's not completely dispensing with truth, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to make the claim that truth lies without some appeal to a deeper truth, a truth of change and flux and becoming, rather than. Nietzsche's relation to truth is very complicated, but it's not, as he is very well aware, it's not like he's just had done with truth.
Right.
His interest in truth ties him to Greek philosophy, to the Western tradition. His obsession, since Socrates at least, with the truth is his tradition. He can't deny that. So
maybe I should start from the ancient more philosophy, because I got into Nietzsche, and that's
stay with Nietzsche.
Do you think?
Nietzsche. Yeah.
Do you think I should go back and start from the?
Well, the good thing about Nietzsche is the aphorisms. The fact that no matter how dense, and some of the aphorisms are dense, but some of them are less dense. So skip the ones the longer and denser, and stay with the shorter, more accessible ones. But an aphorism doesn't last forever, whereas sometimes philosophy books feel like they go on forever.
Yeah, definitely. And so we're kind of still on the same topic of philosophy.
You're really nervous, aren't you, Jack?
But,
you're really nervous.
Nah,
you are.
No. It's just the thing about like being in a microphone, and it all looks very.
It is kind of intense. I've never had a chance to sit down with a professor and talk about politics. Never had the chance before. And
well, I think we're getting somewhere, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely what something like this should be: a chat, an open-ended thing. Let the conversation go where it will, and we don't need to worry too much about whether we've covered all the points, because which points would those be?
Well, that's true. But
anyway, having said that,
I was because I found one section in one of the introduction points in your latest book, Nihilism and Philosophy, Nothingness, Truth and the World. You say that, does the term philosophy mislead? Philosophia is the love of wisdom, but would this be the same thing as the love of truth as it is assumed? Does the love of truth have anything to do with wisdom? So like I'm just quite maybe go into further detail about like what you mean by that.
Well, that's really exactly what I was just saying before, that if wisdom is an account of what is timeless and changeless, you know, purveyors of wisdom always, to this day, you know, they want to claim that this is the way it is with the world. It's always been this way and always will be this way. That for me, philosophy is not, philosophy has, it overlaps with wisdom. There's plenty in philosophy that wants to be timeless, that wants to deal in timeless truths. But I think there's also another element, which is this question of how to live, which I was referring to before, which is also very ancient, and that we find in someone like Nietzsche, but in plenty of other philosophers in the Western tradition as well. And the question, how should I live, is not one that wisdom can really help us that much with, because wisdom talks in generalities, abstractions, whereas the question of how to live has to be continually revisited. You know, you can't, my father can't tell me, he can't provide his insights into living in the form of, you know, a textbook. He can give me advice and that will be relevant, but I have to adapt to my own times, the challenges of my own generation. And the same is true for you guys, a bit younger still. You know, things don't stand still. So that's the distinction, in a, you know, simplified, between wisdom and truth. I mean, I'm caricaturing to make the point there, but I think truth is different from wisdom. It's different from prophecy. Prophecy is, you know, the attempt to predict what is going to happen. I don't think philosophy is centrally concerned with that. Again, doesn't mean it never happens, but it's not the central concern of philosophy. So philosophy isn't about what is timeless. It's not about the future, not trying to predict the future, but really this reflection on living. Yeah, so that's.
And I think that's one of the reasons I really got interested in philosophy, or like the way of living, because otherwise I have nothing to believe in. I come from, you know, family where they believe in Buddhism, but I wasn't a big fan. But I think religion takes place. The religion has a really important place where people have something to believe in. It at least teaches you how to behave and live. And science doesn't tell you that, you know.
No, and that's the one of the main, probably one of the issues of one of the modern day atheists, is that they're trying to, you know, oh, well, can you show me a picture of God? Well, if you can't, then obviously it doesn't exist and all that. But there's a whole bunch of little underlying elements in there that makes someone's belief system believe in certain things, and how people believe in certain religions, and, you know, stuff like that. And I think it's,
and the course we are taking, human rights, we did talk about how religion was really a big influence in establishing what's human rights nowadays we have. And I think that really shows how we get the power deriving from the religion, because it's a big thing, you know. And people who don't have father, like people who's in jail, they convert into Christianity or whatever that is, because I think it adds them value. It tells them how to live, and sometimes I think people need that.
I think the question of how do we live can't be separated. I think this is what you're saying, and I agree with you. Can't be separated from the question of who are we, which is a question about the past. You know, we think that the present is the real thing, the tangible thing, the important thing. But really the present is the hardest thing of all to live. We're being swept along by the tidal wave of the past at every moment. And so understanding what is possible for us right here, right now, is never a question that the present can answer.
Right.
It's only a question that we can ask by looking at how we've got to this point, how we've got to the present, which is why in this course that you're referring to, I take the approach of genealogy, which is, as Foucault summarizes it, a history of the present. it's historical. It's reflecting on the past, but its real concern is how did we become who we are? With the point being that it's only then that we can understand what are the possibilities in the present, the limits of what we can do, but also those small, that little bit of maneuver that we might have, which is never much, but we're mortal. So
I think it's a
live
miracle.
for a few years. Why would we have any options to do anything at all? But I think that the constraints that we're under are much, much more than people probably realize in an era when everybody talks about choice, individual choice, freedom. I don't see a lot of that. I think that that doing something new is the hardest thing of all.
Absolutely.
It seems it's so easy because we talk as if we're constantly doing new things, but really we're often just regurgitating the past because we don't know the past enough to know that that's what we're doing.
And I think you made a really good point when you said there's nothing really you can do about it, and that's actually true. What can I, as an individual, make a huge difference to the world? Just like that, it's impossible. And I really believe that. I see a bunch of university students trying to change the world, solve every single issues in society, but it's too complicated. It cannot be solved like that easily.
I used to be under the impression that it was all common sense solutions, or everything has a common sense, like there's common sense solutions to problems that exist, and that it was kind of like a ease on the mind type of thing. It was a much easier thing for me to, be comfortable with than trying to think of all the complex things that could go, that could influence people's decisions when it comes to, making public policy and all that. And when I, look at politicians and their decisions and what they do, I'm just thinking, oh, they could have done this, that would have been so much better. But no, they have legitimate reasons for believing what they believe, and they might have information that I might not have a hold of. And so I've got to be a bit more self-conscious about that, because a couple of years ago I was a bit more, oh, this is just a common sense problem. This is just a common sense solution. Why aren't they implementing stuff like, why aren't they implementing things? Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But
I mean, I don't think that the fact that change, the new, if you like, is so difficult on an individual level needs to lead us to despair. In fact, for me, it's liberating because there's a lot of pressure to be told. And I've got kids, two of them in high school now, while I'm still in primary school, and they're being told constantly, make good choices. You've probably heard this language, make good choices. They're being told all the time, in every moment, that it's up to them, when actually, as we've been saying, almost nothing is up to them. But that's only depressing if you want to take on the burden of what a terrible thing to think that in every moment it's all down to you, and that basically there's the void, and you've got to choose for yourself, continually having to decide again and again in every moment. That would be absolutely, if we really believed that was human experience, then we'd be overwhelmed by that. Of course, people are overwhelmed. This feeling that I've got to be having a great time, I've got to choose well, but I've also got to maximize my pleasure, I've got to maximize my opportunity, I've got to maximize my capacities, I've got to be all that I can be. People wearing their t-shirts, achieve your goals, beating my personal best, and all this sort of, it's for me, it's really oppressive. Whereas the idea that history is not something that we make on our own, but only collectively with other people at best, and even then, something has to happen, which doesn't depend on us. Real change is like a grace. It's like something that comes from the outside. It's almost a religious thing, like a revolution, thinking in terms of politics. Things are just going on as they've gone on for centuries, and then suddenly there's a revolutionary moment. Individuals don't decide that. Right. Of course, when that comes along, then there's a decision to make. Am I for the change, or am I against the change? Similarly, in love, nothing much happens, and then suddenly somebody comes along and it's like, well, this is different. I have to make a decision. Do I love this person or not? And if I do, then what does that mean? But this is a rare event, but it doesn't depend on us.
So it's like accidental finding.
You can't go out in the morning and say, I'm going to fall in love and make it happen. You can't go out in the morning and say, today there's going to be a revolution.
So it's almost like fortune, you'd
The
say.
new doesn't depend on us. If something really new is to happen, it comes from the outside, and then we make a decision. But that's for me much preferable, more liberating than the thought that everything is on our shoulders.
Right.
That's the thing.
Crippling.
Sorry, but that's the thing that I find really interesting. It's like young people nowadays, especially with those socialist alternative types that used to show up at campus but not anymore, they were always looking for the next revolution, like, the climate action resolution. They want to take down the government. They want to completely, re-engineer it, and they want to, form a new Australia in their own socialistic worldview and all that stuff. And you're right. Like they're actively trying to seek for something that isn't.
Yeah, but I think in that case, it's an echo of a world in which there was politics, in which there was class struggle. I don't think people on the left of the political spectrum are thinking that they can do it on their own, but maybe they are trying to accomplish revolutionary change in a moment that's not revolutionary. In which case, maybe they're banging their head against a brick wall, but it's a difficult one. What do you do while you wait for an event?
Right.
What do you do while you wait
for
something to happen? Yeah. You just sit there passively? I don't know. I mean, it's complicated.
What kind of change would you like to see in the world or in the government? That's very abstract, but why would you like to see? Why is the ideal the world you can have if you can create it?
Well, maybe the notion of sort of starting completely from scratch according to a new blueprint is a bit nihilistic.
Let's
let it all burn, because and this is the problem of all when we long for the new, and I'm not somebody who doesn't long for the new in all sorts of ways, politically, intellectually, but there is always a temptation, a danger of wanting just to tear down what you find yourself with in the name of something radically different from the so not backtracking on everything I just said, but sort of as a related point. I think the desire for something really new to happen there's a sort of nihilistic temptation as well to sort of and Alain Badiou, the French philosopher Alain Badiou, who's been a big influence on me, I think thinks about this very clearly. He has this notion that what should our relationship to the event, to the possibility of something new happening be? And for him, it's not about endlessly tearing down the old order, but it's about creating something new in a positive way. So saying yes to something rather than just saying no. He calls it's a technical term, but he calls it affirmative dialectics. Okay. That change has to start, real change has to start with a yes. And saying yes to something new will lead to all sorts of no's in its train. Yeah. Because once you've affirmed something new in the world, then all sorts of old things will be obsolete. You won't be interested in them anymore. But you don't start with the no. It's sort of a bit abstract, but one of the examples he gives is the Apostle Paul, the founder of Christianity. And he says, well, what does Paul do in, Paul comes along at the height of the Roman Empire. Yep. Does Paul say no to the Roman Empire? No, he doesn't sort of reference the Roman Empire at all. He says yes to Christ is risen. He says yes to his principle of affirmation, which is for him the belief that Jesus has risen from the dead. And that, yes, then ultimately defeats Rome. But if he'd started out by just in pure opposition to Rome, with no affirmative project, with no positive new vision, then no doubt he would have gone the way of all the other people who try to take on Rome, right? Which is that we don't remember that much anymore because they didn't succeed. What succeeded in bringing down Rome, to the extent that Christianity was a sort of overturning of the values of the ancient world, which in many ways it was the ability to say yes to something new, not not the negative project of saying no to something old. It's a bit of a long-winded response to. I don't even know if it was a question.
No, it's all right. Again, this is kind of like the format of a podcast. It's like it's a free-flowing type of thing. There's no strict method of question answer. Even though I was kind of a bit like that in the first.
This for me is a real question. The question of because it relates to my interest in nihilism. Do we when we want to oppose something, when we find something wrong with the world, if we fixate on that and just endlessly try and purge the world of the bad stuff, then we can never purge or purify enough. There's always something that is still stubbornly old and resistant to change. And that whole project can be, it can be very destructive. Whereas affirming something new seems to me a much better way of going about it.
That's very interesting because many people just as you said, destroy the system, destroy everything. Let's create something new. But I think that way of approach is more realistic, I must say. Definitely.
Yeah, and because we are historical creatures, and as we were just saying, our opportunities are shaped by the past. To just to say, let the world burn, is a sort of self-hatred as well, because the people that we are, the possibilities that we have for better or worse, are shaped by a history that, again, for better or worse, we all have in common. We might be differently positioned within that history. Some people benefiting from it, some people definitely not benefiting from it. But we've all got to work with the world as we find it, and just wishing that world would burn. It's a temptation, but is it the nihilistic temptation? That's the question for me.
At that point, would nihilism be considered self-hatred at that point?
Well, I think finding the world objectionable is understandable, because there's much that's objectionable in the world. But to the extent that we can't do anything other than find the world objectionable, then we will end up hating ourselves, because we're in the world. We're not separate from it, pure and discreet and sort of standing alone. Nobody's above the fray. We're all caught up in like I said before, it doesn't mean that some of us benefit more from the way the world is structured than other people, for sure. But we're all caught up in the same mess. This is why I don't think that endlessly going on about, for example, Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump, just to make it sort of contemporary. I'm not a fan of Trump in so many ways that I don't even want to get started. But I don't think that a politics of isn't Trump awful is going to get us very far. It's a negative project. It's reactive. Again, it's coming back to this, what's the difference between, can we start with a yes rather than with a no? And trying to start a politics by saying Trump is awful doesn't go much further. It can't go much further.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean to say that it's easy to come up with an affirmative politics. It isn't. But,
Yeah. And it's like, you're exactly right. I think when people go, okay, they criticize Trump all the time, right? Some news networks criticize Trump all the time, but they're nowhere near to form a solution to the problem. And as to why Trump got elected, all they do is look at the negative parts of Trump and they go, oh, look how bad this guy is and look how good we are. Or it can even go in the opposite way around. Look how good the Republicans are as opposed to those Democrats. It's just an us versus them type of mentality that never gets us anywhere.
Well, the culture wars have that structure of each side of the culture wars takes its legitimacy from denouncing the other. There's a limit to that, I think. Precisely because each side of the culture wars is determined by its rejection of the other side. They're actually locked into a sort of death spiral.
Would you say it's a dangerous path to people to fall in?
Yeah. Yeah. For the reasons that we've been talking about in more abstract terms, about the need to start with the yes and not with the no. But it's easy for me to preach. I don't mean to sound like I've got a formula But
it's
these
very
are
hard.
These are principles that can help us to sort of clear away some of the undergrowth, if you like, that stops us thinking clearly and can lead us down some dead ends.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. What you said about starting with a yes and a no. Like instead of a no, I've never thought of it that way. I genuinely find that really interesting. Like it's just something new for me to think about now.
Although what that yes is
that's
another question.
an entirely new
we won't go
question. It's always about questions.
Oh, and I wanted to ask you a question regarding human nature, because in Introduction to Politics,
Yep.
I remember we were talking about.
I'm gonna quote something against me now.
No.
Dredge up some
No.
throwaway lines.
Because the thing is, workshop is only 60 minutes. 60 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think 60 minutes, 50. Yeah. Roughly around an hour. Yeah.
And people are very interested in what you had to say because it was such a limited amount of time. And I remember we were talking about human nature. I don't know why.
It was a fairly long time ago that we talked about this. So
well, human nature comes up all the time in class because it's usually the way in which people try and, I guess, not necessarily deliberately, but try and close down a discussion by saying, well, that's all very well, Gideon, but the human nature, it won't work. People are selfish. And
So I was wondering how you see, what is your view on human nature? Do you see it as a pessimistic, or do you think progress is possible?
Well, I mean, that is a big question, and I do risk making a complete fool of myself trying to give a definition of human nature, so I won't do that. I mean, I think there are some general points that can be made. They're not my points, but just off the top of my head. I mean, first of all, obviously on the right, you tend to get this idea that human nature is competitive, but then that's what you'd expect from people who want to defend capitalist social relations, because competition is necessary.
That was me.
So, it's natural in a capitalist society, for sure. And you can see it being taught in schools, you can see it being inculcated through media. But does that mean that's all that human beings can be? I mean, I think you don't have to be a Marxist to think that human nature is more malleable than that. I mean, I think so. If the left has tended to see human nature as malleable, and the right has tended to see it as selfish and competitive, I mean, I think I would emphasize that human nature is whatever it is. It would have to be historical.
Right.
It would have to relate to a history. And it would have to relate to language. I mean, human beings have different languages, but human beings have some relationship to language. And language is not a natural thing. I mean, it's not unnatural. Language acquisition is something universal, but we're not born with language. Language is something we acquire. So there's something interesting about the way that our nature, so I don't think of it as nature, but if what is proper to human beings is language, well, language is not in any straightforward sense a natural thing, and in fact it maybe cuts us off from anything natural, because for one thing there isn't a universal language. For another thing, language always, what has been said is never exhausted everything that can be said, so there's always possibility and potential in language. So if our nature is to have language, then it's to have certain possibilities for to be able to say new things and do new things. If we're going to talk about Greek philosophy, Aristotle at the end of his, I don't know if it's at the end, I can't remember where it is, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, so are we supposed to think that he uses the example of the cobbler, shoemaker, and the carpenter. So they have a work that is proper to them. And he says, but are we supposed to consider that man, considered as man, has no work that is proper, no work that is distinctive to him? And he considers that possibility, but then he backs away from it. And he famously goes on to define, certainly in the politics, in his politics, define human nature as linked to rationality. But in the ethics, he considers the possibility that there is nothing that is proper human being as such, that we are without nature. And this is a scary prospect, but I
scary.
like it.
That is scary, yeah,
like
indeed.
It. I
Yeah.
like it. I like the idea that we can always neutralize any claim to human nature in this way. That we can say, well,
Right.
you may have considered that to be the proper thing that human beings are or should be, but we can do something
Okay.
else.
So it could be socially constructed.
Well, there's certainly, like I said, history.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I don't know how you could deny that a lot of what we call our nature is socially constructed. I mean, the whole nature-nurture debate is maybe a little bit outmoded now. The idea that there is a difference between nature and human, the natural world and the social world, rather than the two being two sides of the same coin. But that's another debate. But in terms of human nature, again, I suppose to take a Socratic questioning approach, it would always be a case of saying to people, why? Why would human nature be competitive? What evidence would you have for that?
Well,
Inherently, necessarily competitive, or whatever the claim is being made, rather than to try and put forward a new model of human nature. It might be better to say, really?
I think I was thinking about that question for a while. Like, are we really competitive, and are we really violent? And I thought, and I remember one of the friend was bringing up about the experiment that was done. You extricate person behind the wall, blah blah blah. That, yes.
Yeah.
And I remember you're saying that doesn't prove anything. That just shows what people do under the influence of bureaucracy when people
authority.
Yeah. And I was thinking, okay, so what are the examples of people being violent and very evil? I don't like to use that term, but and I thought maybe bullying could be one example, because I thought no one's telling bully to bully anyone whatsoever. And of course, I think we can socially.
Maybe the bully has been bullied himself or herself.
I think there's element to it, and I think we can socially construct people to be good. I really believe in that. But I think if you look at the reality, it's hard to have it, because not everyone has this equal, nice, kind family where they get the affection.
Yeah.
And I believe that some people don't have the benefit to receive it. And I think that's the reality. And we can't have that perfect family where they're taught to not to bully people. So I that's something I would call nature, if that.
I agree with you that I think conflict, power relations are not something that can ever be erased. I think if we could erase power relations, then everything would stop. There are only relations of power which are mobile. They don't stand still. But yeah, I think the idea that there is a point when human beings could be brought to some sort of perfection would be a wrong-headed notion. I don't.
Yeah, because I think naturally we're all kind of flawed in our own ways. Like, some people can socialize better than others. Some people can, think of can solve math equations quicker than other people, and there's always a case of imperfections, and then you just got to kind of ask the question, what is perfection?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I was about to ask that myself. What would human perfection be anyway?
You can say that someone can be perfect at sports, but then they can't be perfect at everything else, or they could be the best mathematician on the planet, but they're not really too much good for much else. So, like, you know, you could say that this person is the ultimate person in this one area, but can this person be an ultimate in like other areas? And like, I don't think that's possible, because I think we're all gifted in our own different ways. You know, I think we're all naturally talented in one way or another, but yeah, you can't really say that, yes, this human is the absolute perfect human being.
That's why the argument about human nature can be dangerous, because it can be used as that standard by which to say, well, if our nature is to be the rational animal, then if you have less reason, then in some way you fall short of full humanity. And of course, there is a long history of this, of imputing less of a lower human stage to people who don't have full use of reason. But that would apply to any definition of what it is to be human. If we could arrive at that model, then that would also be a stick with which we could beat people who are seen to fall short of perfection.
Yeah, no, it's a
big question.
Yeah, no, good questions.
Big question.
Yeah, and definitely something to really think about too. It's like
along with all the rest.
No, along with all the rest. Yeah, no,
But questioning can be one of the ways out of this nihilist predicament of finding everything questionable and finding that once you question one thing, everything else starts to topple like the chain of dominoes. Well, one way out of this is to reflect on ancient philosophy and how, although it took different forms in most of the philosophical schools, it was a question of coming back to this question of seeking to live the true life as a life in which questioning is central. Questioning in different forms, to be sure, but this concern for truth. You can make that a way of life, and in which you're not necessarily expecting to find the answer, but once questioning the pursuit of truth is your mode of living, then you have an orientation, which is not fixed by some answer that you might one day arrive at, but is actually the process, the journey, the meandering.
So is that the antidote?
It's a form of life, isn't it? In which you give shape to your life as somebody who questions. And this is, for me, in a nutshell, what ancient Greek philosophy was. It's difficult today because religion has, in the West, Christianity, colonized that ancient quest for truth and sort of made it its own. So that today we think of seeking truth as a form of life as something religious, but it doesn't have to be. I think you can shape your life as the life of somebody who questions, without that religious paraphernalia.
Right.
You can say, well, there's a history of questioning, and I relate to that history, and it's going to give me certain powers and capacities. Enable me to do some things and not to do others, and so it's gives me some orientation.
So if you're, say, stuck in this really nihilistic place, I guess the antidote that you're presenting is to keep questioning. That way,
as a deliberate strategy for living. So, in other words, like I say, you're providing some reference points, not by the answers that you're looking for, but by the process.
That is very interesting.
But another approach would be to put this questioning into question and to say, why should life be questionable? You know, Socrates. Let's start with the original.
Wow. Okay.
You know, why do we have to go around? Why do the living have to be put in question? You know, this is one of Nietzsche's points. Socrates is where the rot sets in, because he goes around asking people to justify themselves, as we would say maybe today, justify your existence. You know, you see that sometimes on, we're used to on bumper stickers, justify your existence. It's a bit of a confronting. You're driving along and somebody's stuck, justify your existence. You used to think, hang on a minute, why? I didn't ask to be born.
It's a provocative question.
I'm here, you're there. What's the problem? So I think you could. That's another response. You could say why Western philosophy in the Socratic traditions since Socrates has sort of put life in question, but why couldn't you put the shoe on the other foot and say to philosophy, Western philosophy, why question life? From what privileged position outside of living do you presume to question the living as to how they live? It's a bit presumptuous, isn't it?
That's true.
So maybe another response is just to get on with living and not to let the questions become too corrosive. That's another possible response.
Is that what you do in your?
Yeah, I think it is.
Right.
I think it is. I think if you can't moderate this impulse to question, you can lose the plot.
Right.
And also, like I said, the underlying assumption is that there is something questionable about living, that we have to give an account.
Right.
And that's that's a problem, thinking that at every moment we have to give an account of ourselves. It ties in very much with contemporary the contemporary problem that we have of constantly to justify ourselves to authority figures, to the state, to each other, confessing everything all the time on social media. It's very ancient in Western culture, this confessional culture in which we have to sort of bare our soul. But it relates not only, but it relates amongst other things to the Socratic question, to the Socratic question of why do you live, why do you do what you do, and why do you have to justify your existence?
Right. Yes,
I'm just throwing thoughts out.
Isn't that something that Nietzsche said about creating your own values?
Yeah, there's a lot in Nietzsche about the response to the death of God, to the sort of to the collapse of the highest values in Western culture, being to create new values. But I think that there's another less visible strain in Nietzsche, particularly at the very end, in the last year of his sanity, some of the very final publications, final writings, where he sort of backs away from that, and I think he maybe gets the sense that to ask people to create new worlds is equally or risks the same problem that he's trying to avoid, which is, well, what's wrong with the world that we need to create new worlds? So creating new values, creating new worlds is definitely an emphasis in Nietzsche. But there is this other question, which if you listen, you can hear, that puts that approach into question as well. Why do we need to create new values? Why do we need to create new worlds? If there's nothing wrong with who we are and where we are.
Yeah, it's also like, what values were bad enough to justify the creation of new ones? Like, if the old ones aren't creating any problems, why would you want to create?
It's not. Ones? Yeah, I should clarify. I don't think Nietzsche is saying, "Oh, let's put up with the old values and what's wrong with them anyway." I just think he's in no doubt about the death of God, which is sort of code for the collapse of the highest values, which were all underpinned by this belief in another world, in a true world, in God. It's all the same thing. He's not in any doubt that has collapsed, but I think he maybe realizes or senses that this injunction to go create new worlds, go create new values is maybe part of the problem rather than the solution. So he's not backing down on the problem, which is the death of God, but is the solution to the death of God to go getting busy creating new values and new worlds, or is that really the same problem in different clothes? Of an away from here, always wanting, always looking for some other life, and you can see that in contemporary culture all the time. That whether it's tourism, shopping, trying to get rich, trying to be a sort of inventor of new apps or whatever it is that people hold up as the highest thing. It always has this same logic of you've got to be somewhere you're not right now. You've got to be somewhere else, which is the same logic, I think, at bottom. It's this logic of sort of nihilistic denigration of the world in the name of some other world, which is very ancient. Of course, it looks all very new and shiny and modern because it's dressed up in all these contemporary disguises, but it's the same basic problem of, improve your personal best, be everything that you can be, maximize your potential. There's a certain nihilism at work here, isn't there? Which is like, there's a problem with you and your existence. You need to be something you're not. You need to be somewhere that you're not. Be something else.
I think these days that's becoming more bigger because of this phone device where you have to prove everyone that your life is all good. You look as good as you are.
Justifying your existence.
It's really depressing, and that's one of the reasons why I don't use Instagram or something like that, because I think it would destroy me. It's really because
I'm the same.
Like it's just
not like I'm disdainful of social media as such, but I know I'm not capable of using it without becoming very depressed and despondent.
It's like even people get sensitive over the fact that their new profile picture didn't get as many likes as another person's profile picture, and they might think, well, maybe not as many people like me as the other person, but
that's just sad.
But it's just it's really sad.
That's depressing, and the suicide rate is going up in teenagers everywhere in the world because all these things, this perfection that they will never get. They see all this picture of models that's taken like 100 times, and they pick the one perfect picture, and they see that picture and they want to be that one. That's
it's the old problem of the true world. Like, truth is somewhere I'm not. It's something I'm not. It's just out of reach.
You can't attain it.
You can't attain it now.
And maybe like, and please tell me if I'm kind of reaching with this example, but maybe that one perfect photo of them all, which is usually most of the time also Photoshopped too to make it look even nicer. Maybe that's like another version of like another world that doesn't really exist, but you try to strive for something.
Well, of course it doesn't exist, and we all know this, don't we? We all know that the perfect Instagram pose is not life. It's an Instagram pose. It's a posed, artificial snapshot of a life that can't be chopped up in that way. Life doesn't have that quality of stopping so that we can be perfect and then resuming again. There's I mean, all of these problems are very ancient as well as very new, taking new forms, but struggling with some pretty ancient.
So do you think these things amplify that things we've been struggling throughout the centuries?
I think so.
Okay.
Well, that sounds a bit pompous. I don't know. It's always a temptation to feel that in your own time and place that things are really intensifying and things are really, things are really bad, and that's a perennial temptation, isn't it? And it's not worse. It's just the same problem of the present is the hardest thing to live. You know, we think we're doing something new where we're just regurgitating old problems, and I think we've all agreed that social media is definitely seems to be amplifying all of this.
Do you let your kids use Instagram, social media?
That's a good question, and maybe a bit of maybe not to be discussed publicly. I mean, it's a live question that my wife and I talk about a lot, and it's not easy at all. That's what I'll say.
Even just access to the internet in general can be a really daunting thing for parents to be able to introduce to their children. Because how are you supposed to tell them?
People don't feel they can say, parents, and I'm speaking as a parent, don't feel they can say no partly because of this feeling that the worst thing in the world is if your child falls behind, and that if they're not appearing in the social media space, then really do they exist? How can they? And of course, it's a real question. How can you appear in the world now if you don't appear in social media?
It's scary.
No, it is.
It absolutely terrifies me. Really.
Yeah. No, and to be honest, we don't really even think about it too often either, because it's just such a...
Everyone uses it.
Yeah, we've grown up with it even. Like
Sure.
people
That's true.
People that have grown up with it, like we don't... Like people that are like our parents' age or something like that, they didn't grow up with that. They had to adapt to that new technology. We grew up with that technology, so we didn't even really question what we grew up with.
That's true. Yeah,
but
you're right.
Maybe they would be more inclined to question what's going on, but we don't, because it hasn't harmed us in any way. Maybe I don't know about your guys' personal experiences on the internet, but it hasn't harmed us in any way. Like it's a very no, sorry, I've lost my thought process.
Some new things become, like all technology, some new things become possible and some things become impossible. I mean, privacy is something that you can't really see where it could take place anymore. Yeah. But if you have never known that as a value, then you're not missing anything. So it couldn't be, you couldn't sort of say privacy is a value that has to apply in all places at all times to all generations in the same way. Certainly for my part, I'm glad that my past is not all on social media.
I think we
and
all
all my
are.
past utterances and
I think we all are in a way, because if all of our past are on social media, then we all say stupid things. We all do stupid things when we're younger and older and stuff like that. It's I wouldn't say it's quite a fact, but everybody does stupid, silly things.
It makes it very difficult to accomplish change, coming back to this problem of identity and difference, of how is change possible. One of the things that makes change possible is the obscurity of what you were before.
Right.
So, personal reinvention.
Right.
I think these things are, well, I've certainly benefited from that, but it's presumably much harder now to appear in the world in a different way. Because the record of everything.
Yeah, constantly. Yeah, right. It's on the record. Yeah. That's right.
So there's something, that's the diabolical element for me of the, for me, what's liberation is not having to be where I was previously. The possibility that my life can take new forms and new directions. Yeah. And to be pinned to something that you, from your past is obviously, for many people, problematic, and it would be for all of us.
I mean, would you say that politicians are like the least free in that regard, because they, no matter what they did, how many years ago, someone's going to bring it up somewhere, and stupid posts on Facebook from like 10 years ago, and then the press bring it up as like a legitimate point for people trying to elect you.
I mean, and maybe it is legitimate. Maybe if somebody expresses, for example, racist or homophobic opinions, then that's something that people need to know about if they want public office. But and I would agree with that. But again, the problem is, to what extent are people allowed to change and capable of change? It's an open question. But if we start with the assumption that what somebody said 10 years ago must be what they think now, or must be linked indelibly to what they are now, then that's that's a big claim to make.
It's a grey line as well.
Yes, but it's very.
How much would you allow people to grow up and change, and you don't know the exact measurements? Is what he said 10 years ago, should it be taken account to him 10 years later, where after he changed a lot, and we don't have the exact measurement regarding to that.
Yeah, and I know that my personal viewpoints on the world and politics are not the same now as they were 4 years ago. In fact, they were completely different. But yeah, no, you're right. I think there are some people that are probably incapable of changing their worldview in just a matter of a couple of years or even decades. And yeah, obviously you can't hold people accountable for that. Yeah, it's a difficult
this is where one of the things that have been lost in Western culture with the decline of Christianity is the idea of sort of conversion. The idea that you can be something, or you can be a certain type of person, and then you can turn around and be radically changed by an encounter. Of course, in the religious description of it, an encounter with God or with the divine, something of that order. But we've lost that sense that people can turn around, that their lives can turn around. That seems to have been. It seems to be linked to religious experience, and we don't seem to have found a way of allowing that to be a secular experience where people can be convicted of having been going on the wrong path and turn around and pursue a different path. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what point I was trying.
Getting really deep.
We're getting really, really deep. And that's the thing about asking those deep questions is like you start
it gets
to
you
go
lost sometimes.
Different tangents, and then you try to think of how that can relate to different things, and then you just lose your point halfway. Like that's probably one of my biggest problems, as you probably already know. I've done it a few times where I was on the point of saying something, and I was like, oh, I could have shut up like just 2 minutes ago, and I would have been perfectly fine. And then,
well, you've been in class all day, and I've been teaching all day, so we should cut ourselves some slack.
Yeah.
What is what excites you the most in teaching as a professor? Is it something that you enjoy?
Yeah, I love teaching.
Right.
I mean, I think teaching for me can't be separated from research, or it's a shame. I mean, it can be, and maybe increasingly it is. Specialization in universities, like in every other area of life. But for me, teaching and research need to go together. The best teaching is informed by research. It seems obvious to say it, but and good research is informed by having to make your ideas accessible, having to, if you can't be understood by bright young people, not that all students are young, but most undergraduate students are young people. If you can't convey your research interest to that audience, then there's a problem. So it's a good discipline. I mean, it doesn't always work. I mean, there's countless occasions where I've tried to, as you know, because you've been in my classes, I've tried to throw ideas which I think are relatively interesting and fairly well formed, and then I throw them into the class context, and I realise that they're not. And the sort of incomprehending looks on your face give me pause for thought, and I have to go back to the drawing board and think, actually, maybe I don't understand this like I think I do. But when I know that I can communicate something in a classroom, then I know I've got something there that I can use and I can work with. So that's a really good discipline. And I like. I mean, to the extent that I'm interested in philosophy, I think philosophy is for the young. I mean, Plato said that you can, after 40, you're useless to philosophy. Too set in your ways, and I think there's probably some truth in that. You're too invested in the world.
Right.
You've got too much to lose. Right. Of course, this is not universally true, but as a rule of thumb, it is true. I mean, it's not that people become less cognitively able. That can happen with advancing age, but it's more that there's this investment. It becomes more painful, and you get more at stake in asking these big questions than young people. All other things being equal. So, I think it's a great privilege to corrupt the young.
People absolutely love your lectures. It really sparks us something, and I can see that in my friends because we'd talk about you after the lecture or workshop, and we're like discussing all these ideas that you brought it up, and that was a truly great experience, and I loved it. Yeah.
Well, it's good that that's how you experienced it. I mean, I loved that first year course because it does provide a context for asking those big questions. It can be a bit more difficult in more advanced specialist courses, but I've always loved that first year course because that's where I get to sort of cut loose a bit and ask those big questions. But I mean, it's a shame that after a first year course, for many people, that's the first and the last time that I'll ever ask those big questions.
Right.
Life sort of takes its own course, doesn't it? We get busier and busier, and work, and the rest of it crowds in, and those questions get pushed out. But I think if you can't ask them once, then that would be a failure, wouldn't it? If you go to university and come out the other side and not have asked one of the big cliched questions of why am I here, what does it all mean, which people are sort of embarrassed by in an age where universities feel they need to equip people for the real world, whatever that is, and for the workplace, that these sorts of questions are seen as indulgent, and but I don't see it that way.
It was definitely taught a lot differently than I thought it was going to be, Intro to Politics, because I've heard a bunch of other people, because I think there's another tutor lecturer that does that Intro to Politics course as well. I'm not too sure.
Well, I teach it as an introduction to basic political concepts. Which you have to sort of approach philosophical, like democracy, freedom, equality. You can't just approach them. For me, these are abstractions, the concepts. And if you start by assuming that we have them and that we know what they are, then you miss the point. We don't. We ask ourselves, what is democracy? And we can't really think of any answers.
I couldn't.
So it's a bit of a cheat to begin by, say, describing Australian democracy, because that presupposes we know what we're talking about. And the truth is we don't know what we think we know. And that's an uncomfortable thing. But it has to be
questioned. It has to be questioned. And that was very challenging. And
definitely.
Yeah, wasn't it? Because it's something we take it for granted.
Yeah.
As it exists.
I just thought democracy was the be all and end all. Like that was the peak. We can't go any further than this to be any more, democratic or, have any more choices. But obviously there are some flaws in different types of democratic systems, like our system as opposed to the first past the post system in the UK and stuff like that. And it's just it got me thinking.
One party states have one party and we have two. So
yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. That's the thing.
Things must be going really well.
That's the thing about that's the thing that really got me thinking about democracy. Because in our constitution, like there's nothing saying that there has to be two major parties. Liberal and Labor aren't the only two major parties. We can get anybody in if we really want to, but I guess in terms of a democracy, we kind of failed in that regard to pick, like, for us to really choose anybody that we really want to get into power. Like, you don't see a lot of people saying that they want sorry, lost it again. That's the point where I should have stopped 2 minutes ago. But no, like, obviously our democracy isn't perfect, and I used to think that it was somewhat perfect.
But to make those judgments about, how close to perfection are we, would already require some knowledge of this yardstick of democracy that we're measuring ourselves by. If democracy is just whatever we do, and we are by definition democracy, if democracy is us and we are democracy, then it's just a circular argument, isn't it? We can only claim to be living in a democracy to the extent that we have some yardstick, some concept of democracy. But of course, as soon as we do that, we can no longer be quite so confident that we enjoy such a robust democracy here or in any other modern democracy.
Like, even in the UK, there was a case where the Liberal Democrats Party got like 2.3 million votes, and then one of the Green parties got more seats than they did in Parliament, but they got like only 500,000 votes, like very much fewer votes than the Liberal Democrats Party. And that to me, when I found that out, I was just like, well, is this really that good of a system then? Like what happens to get the numbers at the way that they got them? And yeah, it really got me thinking after, how good is democracy really? Is there ways that we can, improve it? Are there ways that we can, make it more representative for people's interests? And that's it got me thinking a bit more about that now than I did even a year ago.
So what do you think is the way forward for improving democracy? Do you think?
That's a hard question. But I
ask the questions of you.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
But I believe that I really believe in. You may not like this, but I really believe in the will of individuals, will of individuals, and how they can change themselves. And I don't believe that everyone's got the family issues, and you have family dramas, I have family dramas. There's only 5 or 6, 10 players in that game, and you can't even change that. I've been trying to solve these complex issues, but I can't change it. So how can I change some bigger scale where it involves corporation, government, NGO, all these actors?
We're asked to choose at precisely the point when there's nothing left to decide.
Yeah. And you can't change that, really. And I believe that maybe the smallest change you can make is yourself and the things surrounding you. And maybe that could be a community. I don't think that change can be brought up to the state level. And I think we really have to try hard to make our surroundings better in order to get that change. I don't think this, as you said, it's hard to...
I agree. I think democracy of everyday life is the way to go. How can we democratize where we are, the institutions that we're in, university departments, neighborhoods. How can we democratize the state, the modern state? I mean, it's a big challenge, and maybe too big for me. So if we start a bit more locally and think about what political equality would mean in our everyday lives, in institutions that we find ourselves in the workplace. We spend most of our lives in the workplace, and this is the place of all places that's the least democratic, and just a little improvement in workplace democracy for most people would be a lot more significant than a little bit of change here and there. Absolutely. At the level of representative democracy.
Absolutely.
How much difference is that going to make to your life? It's the scale of modern democracy is so big that it's just the modern state is a very, very hard thing to bring under democratic control. It may be impossible. It may be attempting the impossible.
Yeah, and then again, even if similar to Kenji's experience about questioning democracy, it's like if you dare kind of question it, people will be taken aback by it. They'll just go, okay, why would you need to question something that's already pretty good right now? And that's also the same feeling that I had. That's the same feeling that I had. But I think that asking those questions might not inherently be a negative thing. I personally, and this is my own personal hypothesis throughout the months that I've been trying to kind of formulate it, but I don't necessarily think that asking questions is always inherently negative. I think that it can lead to genuinely positive change to some people, and there's always a chance for a second opinion, and maybe the way of asking questions, the way that you ask questions, can lead to good. It can be a positive thing rather than being inherently a negative thing that you have to fight off.
And I think people really, again, get that allergic reaction, right? When you make a statement like democracy in Australia doesn't exist, people get really upset. I was one of them. And to write something or to solve something, you have to find the issue, right? And that's the issue. It doesn't seem to be existing.
Yeah.
So what can you do about it? And again, we come to the conclusion of what can you do as an individual?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really big thing,
Mm.
you know?
Yeah. And I think also like with those, figures like Jordan Peterson and all those, not necessarily every single self-help guy or girl that spreads the good word of self-help, but I think improving yourself at an individual level can be very important to try and be a net benefit to society, because obviously society benefits from having more people that are more confident with themselves, that are more functional. And I think that self-help is a very important part about that, and that's what I think personally Jordan Peterson's message is pretty important, because he has changed many people's lives, and that's a net benefit to society. If you can solve people's problems at an individual level, he might not be able to solve all of the world's problems. He might not be able to solve climate change or all of these larger than life issues, but
I'm picking up on Jordan Peterson being more and more influential, particularly for young guys like yourself. I don't know anything about his approach myself, but yeah, I mean, to the extent, I'm talking out of ignorance, but to the extent that he's peddling, if indeed he is, self-help, then maybe we need to come back to that question of, is that really what we need? The idea of improving ourselves, is that going to get us somewhere we aren't already? Aren't we constantly being told we need to improve ourselves, be the best that we can be? And doesn't this really reflect the death of politics, the death of class struggle, and the fact that what we're left with is that we're working on ourselves so desperately because we no longer have any faith that we can really change the world? Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe it does reduce that maybe motivation or passion of trying to seek that change, because, as you said, if you're really focusing on individualism and self-help, that kind of diminishes this spark in you, right? So maybe in a sense, these university students who want maybe radical change, it's maybe something we need,
Maybe, yeah.
Because I myself is really dedicated to improving myself and not really the others, because that's the conclusion that I came into, and it's really hard once you get stuck in that not the ideology but idea. It's really hard to get out. Yeah, and
it presupposes that we know what we're working towards, like what would a better version of you be. Seems to me you can't divorce care of self from this question of what is the self you're taking care of, and what is the care that you should take.
Yeah.
We've been talking
Yes,
like a long time. Do you think we should? I hate to break up the fun conversation, but
we're nearing on like 10 minutes to 8 o'clock. So
yeah.
Oh, really?
We've been talking for ages. It's gone by really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you for the
pleasure,
for the very substantive conversation.
More questions. More questions in my head.
More questions.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
No, not at all.
That's great. Yeah.
So just so everybody else on the video knows, we don't necessarily have a schedule when it comes to this, so we don't know when the next guest will be, or we don't really have a very strict schedule about it. So whenever we find
we'll work it out.
We'll work something out. This is just a thing that's kind of like a spare time type of thing, so it's not really too dedicated at the moment, but it might change. But yeah, anyway, thank you.
It was very much fun.
It's been great
really
fun.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Yes.
Appreciate that.
And we'll see you guys next time on the next Uni Chats podcast.
Yeah.